So we're going to take a look at Thebes today, the ancient name for Luxor. In fact, the most ancient name is Waset, which was the ancient Egyptian name for the town. And we know this city from the incredible selection of monuments there. I mean, this has the greatest concentration of standing monuments of probably any city in the ancient world. For example, here, Medina at Habu, where the University of Chicago has worked since 1924, Valley of the Kings, in the tomb of Ramses IV. I mean, these absolutely incredibly preserved monuments from 3,000 and more years ago. Here, Karnak, the hypostyle hall, Luxor Temple, the Ramesseum. It's unbelievable how much is crammed into this one site. So why is Luxor so important? What is the function of so many temples in such a small area? So the key to understanding all of these monuments that are in such a small condensed area is the god Amun, who's shown here on the right. So when you look at Thebes, here's a wonderful reconstruction of the city with the east bank toward the bottom of the screen and the west bank on the upper part of the screen. The city of Thebes is often viewed as two parts. So the east bank with the temples of Karnak and Luxor and the Mut temple, and then, which is often called the land of the living or the festival temples, and then the west bank, the so-called land of the dead, because the tombs are there, and also the great, what are used to be called funerary temples. But the point I want to make today really is this is a false division, because Eastern and Western Thebes were all part of a vast master plan designed to serve the cult of the god Amun. So I want to take a look at the theological, architectural, and economic links between Eastern and Western Thebes to give an idea of how the whole city functioned as a uniform whole. So first, a few words about Waset and its history. So the West Bank, we have remains from the Old Kingdom. There's nothing you'll see today when you go there from the Old Kingdom. For those of you who are not very familiar with Egyptian history, the Old Kingdom is like 2500 BC. There are some Dynasty 3 and 4 mastabas at El Tarif, which is the northernmost part of the West Bank, and a few Dynasty 6 tombs. But again, this is nothing you see when you're there as a tourist. It's just archaeological remains. The East Bank also has some Old Kingdom remains at the Karnak area, but it's really in the late First Intermediate period and Middle Kingdom, so around 2000 BC, that things start to develop. For example, in the 11th dynasty, we have this pillar from the Intefs, one of the kings, and here the detail to the right mentions the god Amun. So we start seeing buildings in honor of the god Amun as early as the 11th century at the site that later becomes Karnak. Earliest standing monuments at Karnak are just little bits and pieces that are left. The Middle Kingdom temple was in this area between the hypostyle hall. We're looking at the back of the hypostyle hall, and my back is to the Thutmose of the third temple. So it was in this area that the Middle Kingdom temple were being built. And we think this is what it looked like, the temple that sat within that area. This was built at the beginning of Dynasty 12 by Senwosret I. And of course, all of this has to do, this sort of orgy of building that goes on at Karnak has to do with the function of the temple. Most of you know that these temples were considered to be the abode of the god, the home of the god. And the god or goddess, whoever was the main resident of the temple, lived in the sanctuary, which was akin to the bedroom of the temple. It was the deepest, darkest part of the temple. And that deity, in the form of a statue of precious material, was housed in a naos, or a shrine. You can see in this wonderful reconstruction by Gauvin. And this god was thought to have the same physical needs as humans. So it needed food and drink and entertainment and clothing and all these sorts of things. And so these temples were really the manifestation of the needs of the particular deity of the temple. The god or goddess liked to get out of the temple. This is an example of perhaps one of these cult statues. This is from the Miho Museum in Japan that was in one of these shrines. The god or goddess liked to get out of the bedroom and go for a spin through the temple and leave the temple, go to visit other temples, visit other gods. And so the statue of the god would be placed on a boat in a shrine on a boat, and then it would be carried through the temple. And so as a result, you have the architectural accommodation for these processions, which are these big processional ways, these usually straight axis. There's usually one east-west and north-south that allow these processions to go from the sanctuary through the temple. And this is a time then people would have a chance to adore the deity. Now, most of the early limestone architecture of the Middle Kingdom is gone. Most of it was removed and used to rebuild other parts of the temple. But we do have a few spectacular examples of this earliest architecture. Anyone who's been to Egypt has seen this. We always make sure that our Oriental Institute visitors go to this part of the Karnak Temple. Spectacular, beautiful limestone chapel of Senwosret I, called the White Chapel. So the Middle Kingdom, we have a lot of building, and then we start seeing more and more building. And by the 18th dynasty, we see more of these chapels. Again, these chapels are to accommodate the processions of the god on the boat. So the boat would be brought into this sort of chapel. It's open on the front and back, would go in, would rest. And so these chapels, the one I just showed you, we don't know the exact original location. They were disassembled in later times in ancient days, used as fill in other monuments. In other words, they were in the way as they expanded the temple, and so they were removed. So we have these reconstructed to show what the earlier types of architecture looked like. By the Thutmosids, so Thutmosid are the first, second, and third, and Hatshepsut, all these people, of course, there's just a tremendous amount of building going on. Thutmose III builds this large temple called the Akhmenu in the back of Karnak. And then, of course, we end up with the hypostyle hall and many other aspects. The building was organic. It was constantly being added onto. It was like a continuous construction site. One king would embellish the temple, then he would expand the temple. The next king would come and probably demolish anything in mud brick that his predecessors had made, rebuild in stone. So this building was constantly being added onto. So it's not surprising, it's kind of confusing when you're walking through this temple because it's 2,000 years of building. In the 18th dynasty, of course, so 18th dynasty is New Kingdom, then we also start seeing, of course, other building. The Luxor Temple, which is south of the Karnak Temple here, primarily Amenhotep III and then Ramses II. And so we have lots and lots of stuff going on in this period. So this temple was dedicated also to Amun. The Karnak Temple is also Amun's temple. This is also Amun's temple. This gets confusing for people in Luxor because they say, well, why does Amun have so many temples? It doesn't seem logical, but Amun was a very important god, as we'll see. There were many different manifestations of Amun, and so each of these temples was built to a different manifestation of Amun. This is Amun of Ipitsut in his southern residence or southern harem. Karnak continued to be a major city actually through the Roman period and a center of building activity. It was not actually the capital of Egypt, although it's one of the most famous cities in Egypt. The capital, administrative capital, was normally in the north. So during the period of the kingdoms, Thebes was, you might say, the theocratic capital, especially in the New Kingdom and the late period, but it was not actually the administrative center, although it was extremely important for the administration. So going back to Amun, here's Amun again on a obelisk of Hatshepsut. So who is Amun and why is he so important? Why does he get so many temples? When you think of the gods, he is one of the most important deities, but he's kind of a slippery concept. He's not like Ptah, the creator god, the god of craftsmen, or Hathor, who is associated with love and dancing and music. Or Osiris is the god of resurrection. Amun, his name actually means the hidden one. And we think that refers perhaps because of his omnipresence, and he was transcendent. He was everywhere. He is shown, as you see here, as a man, one of his manifestations as a man with a flat top crown with two very large plumes. But he can also be seen as a ram, which is where we get the cryosphinxes, the sphinxes with the ram heads, goose. And there's even an aniconic form of Amun where he truly is hidden, which is really amazing. In the later period, you get these wonderful statues of a chair with no God in it. And it's the aniconic form of Amun. He's just not being shown. Amun is known from the Old Kingdom, from the pyramid text, but he's very prominent in the New Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then becomes really the preeminent god, the so-called king of the gods in the New Kingdom. And he is also called the Lord of the Thrones of the Two Lands. Amun was very closely associated with the king. And as we'll see, this is really, really important for understanding what's going on in Luxor. The king is sort of the divine counterpart, Amun is the divine counterpart to the king. Another important thing to think about as we're looking at Thebes is one of the most fundamental aspects of Egyptian religion is the concept of eternal life associated with the solar cycle. And this is actually kind of a two-part cycle, one associated with the sun, the god Re, or Amun Re, and the other part of the circle, the light and dark. The dark part is associated with Osiris, the god of the underworld. It's often called the Osirian Re Osiris cycle. So this is most easily manifested and most obviously manifested in, of course, the solar cycle itself. The sun comes up, that's the birth of Amun Re. It sets, that's the death of the god, and the sun goes down into the dark realm of Osiris, only to be reborn at dawn. This unending cycle, which was the cycle of life and death inherent in these gods. And we'll see how this cycle is absolutely incarnate in the architectural plan of Luxor. Now, the West Bank that you're looking at here, the aerial view of Drabunaga in the background there, the mortuary theology is really pretty simple. As I mentioned, the idea being that you die, you're then associated with the god Osiris, because gods never die, because you're Osiris, you're reborn forever and ever. So the thing that's very important with thinking about Luxor is the West is the place where Amun Re went to join the mountain. And we have texts that say Amun desired to rest in the Western mountains in order to unite with Osiris. These texts say that Amun was said to Abat Imentet, desire the West, to complete that solar cycle of eternal life. So the West Bank also is topped with the Gorn, as it's called here, which is a pointed mountain, which is thought to maybe, we're not sure if we're reading too much into this, symbolize a pyramid. Again, this idea of eternal life. The area was a special abode of deities of death and rebirth, primarily Hathor, again, this goddess of love and rebirth and joy and drinking and sex and all the fun things in life. And then also other goddesses, primarily this one, Merit Seger. Her name means she who loves silence. And she's shown, you can see here, as a cobra-headed deity, but she's shown in many different forms. And she was specially revered on the West Bank also. These deities were thought to dwell in the hillsides. So for example, here, a stela in the British Museum, and here you can see the Hathor as a cow emerging from the squiggly lines are the western hills of Luxor. And so here the goddess is emerging from those western hills. The man from Dera Medina is adoring her, Hathor, as part of this cycle. And then at the top of the stele, of course, you see the boat of Re. So this whole cycle of birth and death inherent in the West Bank. This idea of life emerging from the West Bank, we see this in all sorts of tombs. Here from Dera Medina, the lower register here, the goddess lifting the disk of the sun out of the hills of the West Bank. And the hills are shown as this wonderful little dotty, you can see it's supposed to be sand, the little pink dots and waves are sands, are pieces of sand. And then you can see the goddess even has Ankh signs, those looped crosses over her wrists, again saying that the sun is being reborn from the western hills of Thebes. We see this in the royal tombs too. In the upper center of this image, you can see a big red sun disk. There are arms underneath it, the goddess pushing the sun over the horizon to be reborn. We have lots of scenes of the deceased being suckled by goddesses, especially Hathor, because she takes the form of a cow. But there are other goddesses who are also associated with this. Merit Seger, as I mentioned, is very associated with rebirth. Also Anubis, Satet, and other deities. Now, there was the idea that the goddess, as I mentioned, the goddesses did dwell in these western mountains. This theology was perfectly suited to the geology because the rock-cut tombs, this is another reason why they're doing rock-cut tombs, the idea being going into the realm of the underworld, going into the realm of these deities that give you rebirth. There are, in fact, the crags of the western mountains called Dehnet in ancient Egyptian was one of the names of Merit Sager. So Merit Sager is so closely associated with the hills of the west. It is very interesting that one Egyptologist has even likened the crevasses that you see here, which occur near the private tombs, as a sort of false door, a natural false door that allowed the deceased access to the gods, because these holes into the hills we know were specially revered as places where you could communicate with the deity. For an example of a rock-cut tomb, here the tomb of Hui. So this whole idea of doing these rock-cut tombs takes on a whole new significance when you think about what they're doing. They're doing rock-cut tombs to get closer to the gods and to the sort of regenerative sphere of the Western mountains. So looking back again at Thebes in a larger context, I want to take a look at the connections between the East and the West. Now, first of all, there's an absolutely clear alignment between the Eastern Bank and the Western Bank. What you see in the bottom, to the right of the bottom screen of the screen is the big square, which is the Karnak Temple. And directly across from that on the West Bank, across the Nile, on the other side is an area called Drabunaga. Very little is there, so tourists, we don't usually go there. And this is an area just north of Darabahri. And this is the site of some of the earliest structures on the West Bank. And this is because this area, Drabunaga, and the area slightly to the north of it, Tarif, was referred to as the forecourt of Amun. This area on the West Bank was actually considered to be an extension of the Karnak Temple. So this is like the western reach of the Karnak Temple on the West Bank. Also recall that the West was a place where Amun went to join the mountain. We have texts that say that Amun-Re desired to rest in the Western mountains in order to unite with Osiris. And so Amun-Re, who lives at Karnak, then is going directly across to his Western forecourt to be reborn each day. This, it's not so surprising then that the earliest tombs that we have are directly across from the Karnak Temple in Drabunaga. They look similar to this. You can see the small rows of recesses. There are two sets of them in the middle of the screen and to the left, a whole bunch of little like windows in the hill. This is a type of tomb called a soft tomb. These are not the earliest tombs, but this is what the earliest tombs at Drabunaga looked like. These were directly, as I said, across from the Karnak Temple, and these were the tombs of the rulers of the 11th dynasty. So this area directly across from Karnak has special sanctity. It's only later, when there's more and more building, that the buildings start moving south, because the north has already been built up. Dynasty 11 and 12, Mentuhotep builds his great monument at Darabahri, just south of Drabunaga. This is a reconstruction of that, and this is what it looks like. If you look at the soft tombs that we're just looking at, the holes in the hillside, you can see how Mentuhotep's temple really is like a double-stacked soft tomb. So he's building in exactly that same tradition. So the kings of Dynasty 17 are buried, again, as I said, at Drabunaga. This is the remains of one of those royal tombs. You can see very different than the Valley of the Kings, these early tombs. They originally had pyramids on top. These were the kings of Kamoza, Intef 5, 6, and 7, but very poorly preserved. A lot of them are just foundations. But what this all hints at is what becomes more clear in the New Kingdom, that the connections between the king and Amun are so strong that in some periods their identities are fused. And this is really what Karnak and Luxor and the whole part of Thebes is about. Now, there are not only burials on the west. We know that Amenhotep I, very early 18th dynasty, built shrines for processions at Drabunaga near Bahri. It's an indication that the processions of Amun and his entourage, probably, are already the very beginning of the 18th dynasty, crossing from the Karnak temple over to this northern part of the West Bank at Drabunaga. And what we see is this, later in 18th dynasty, the evidence gets much, much more clear about these festivals I'll talk about in a minute that physically link the East and the West Bank. Initially, the earliest tombs on the West Bank are temple and tomb all in one. For example, at Mentuhotep, the temple, the tomb was within this structure. Then in the 18th dynasty, we see the split of the mortuary complex. The burial is placed in the Valley of the Kings, and then the cult of the king is celebrated in the huge temples that dot the West Bank. So, for example, this is not a royal tomb, but a tomb. So you separate the tomb from the temple in this period. And so the West Bank, because all the tombs are located in the Valley of the Kings for the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. This is a plan of the West Bank where you get this incredible array of these enormous temples built by almost every ruler of the New Kingdom that line the West Bank. It's these royal tombs are quite interesting. The idea of being placed in the Valley of the Kings, where they can be guarded and where they are not to be really visited. We have in the inscription of the architect Eneni, who built the tomb of Thutmose I, he talks about putting the king's tomb in a place that is not seen and a place that is not heard, and so a very secret place. So we have the establishment of the tomb separately from the temple. And in fact, one of the earliest temples, these commemorative temples, that of Amenhotep I, is, not surprisingly, at Drabunaga in the north, right across from the Karnak temple, again, in this earliest part of the concentration of the monuments on the West Bank. And then, as I mentioned, we start getting more and more building, and you can see Bahri at the very top of Hatshepsut and Mentuhotep, and then progressively going south as the area gets full of these temples. So here, Hatshepsut at Bahri, the Temple of Kumahatan of Amenhotep III, gradually being put back together, as some of us who were last in Egypt got to see, but known primarily for the colossi of Memnon. The successors of the Thutmosids, so the kings of the 19th and 20th dynasties, continue this tradition of building enormous temples. So we have Seti I at Gorna, and of course, the one that all of us in Chicago love so much, Medina Habu, our home away from home on the West Bank. Then also, of course, the Ramesseum, and many, many other temples lined this area of the West Bank. So it's just amazing when you imagine what this looked like when all of these temples were still standing in antiquity. But again, this is one of the joys of going to visit Egypt, because so much of this, in fact, is still standing, that you can see it. It's not like lovely scenario when you're someplace with a guide and the guide says, imagine what used to be here. You know, there's a hole in the ground, and so what used to be here? But in Egypt, it's all still standing for you to see. But it's very important, again, with understanding what's going on the West Bank and in Thebes overall, that it's not just funerary temples that were built on the West Bank. One of the most important of them is what we now call the small temple at Medina Habu. It's called Jesserset, the holy place. This was originally probably a Middle Kingdom temple that was rebuilt by Hatshepsut and then Thutmose III, and then added on to all the way into the Roman period as an indication of how very important it was. Thutmose claims that he restored an older temple, and this temple was so important because it was thought to be the burial place of Amun. He was interred there with 8 gods of the Ogdoad. And in ancient Egyptian, this is called the Yat Chamut, the mound of the mothers and fathers. This is the place of regeneration where the gods would be reborn. And so, as we'll see, this became a major focus of rituals at Thebes that further linked the East and West Banks. Looking at the temples in the West, it's kind of hard to define their function. They used to strictly be called mortuary temples, funerary temples. Now they're sometimes called commemorative temples, cult temples. And this is all because it's kind of hard to get a bead on what these enormous temples actually were. Traditionally, people looked at these Western temples as strictly funerary temples, as part of the overall tomb complex, because they have Osirian iconography. For example, here at Medina Habu, the columns show the king as Osiris, and many of these temples, Darabahri also. What are these temples really about? Nowadays, they're usually called something more sort of generic, like commemorative temples, because we know they were built to accommodate and perpetuate the cult and memory of the deceased king. Just like the temples on the East Bank, like Karnak and Luxor, they were staffed by priests. They were places where prayers were said for the king, offerings were left. It was once assumed that these temples were where the body of the king was prepared, where the mummy was prepared, and where the cult of the king was celebrated. But there's really no evidence these temples have anything to do with the mummy of the king. One can understand this confusion because these structures had other sets of rooms whose function were really unexplainable, but they were clearly related to the commemoration of the dead or to the cult of Osiris. And our understanding of these temples is hampered also by the blurring of the functions, because when you start looking at the temples on the west that have these Osirian columns, well, we see the same thing on the East Bank. So what are these Osirian columns doing on the East Bank if there's a nice discrete division of East and West, living and dead? So the difficulty in our initial understanding of the function of these West Bank temples is because they are not specifically funerary. And they commemorate not only the king, but they commemorate Amun as well. We now know that the East and West worked closely tied, economically and ritually, to form part of a unified network of monuments dedicated to Amun and to the cult of the king, but the king often as a form of Amun. Part of this realization comes from this closer study of the temples. First of all, the temples all have names. The Egyptians named everything. So the temple has a name, doors of a temple have a name, passageways have a name, the hypostyle halls have specific names. All the temples on the east and west of the Nile in Luxor are referred to as being Emper Amun, in the domain of Amun. So this is something that links them. They are all considered to be part of the domain or the overall cultic and economic holdings of the god Amun. Only a few decades ago, more similarities between the East and West temples were noted. For example, the names of all the Theban monuments had something in common on East and West. They're called mansions of millions of years. And then they had a specific name. So it'd be mansion of millions of years of Thutmose III, blah, 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 and the name, in the domain of Amun. So for example, the West Bank, here of the small temple of Amun and Medina Habu, the hieroglyphic, this is an architrave, and the left part of it says, the temple of millions of years. One of the words is cut off. But here, when you start looking at these architraves, it's very clear. They're telling you what these temples are about, that these are all considered to be mansions of millions of years of the god Amun. The so-called non-mortuary temples on the East Bank, and also many of the temples in Nubia, the Luxor Temple, the Hypostyle Hall, these are all mansions of millions of years. For example, so Karnak also, and Abu Simbel is also a mansion of million of years. And so there's a huge amount of common theology with these temples. We used to sort out into like funerary and non-funerary. Now, what were the specific functions of these mansions of the millions of years? Well, first of all, they were a place where Amun or Amuns, because there are a lot of different Amuns, meet during festivals and go. And they are a place where the king and Amun fuse. And this is very important for Egyptian theology and statecraft because this expresses the divinity of the king. The king was semi-divine. He was not ordinarily divine, but he expressed his divinity primarily in the course of festivals. And this is often when he becomes united with Amun. The identity of these temples was unclear until it was understood that they're not one thing or another. They're dedicated to the cult of the king and to the cult of Amun, but also to the king as Amun. They stress his divinity through his deification and his rejuvenation, because as Amun, the king won't actually die, because gods don't die. In hindsight, there were many indications that these temples really had a lot more in common than what people thought. It's very clear from a standard inscription found all over the Theban temples. It's translated as he, the king, has made a monument for his father, Amun-Re. He has made as a monument for his father, Amun-Re. So the temples that were thought to be dedicated to the king is actually dedicating these temples to Amun as well. So they serve this dual purpose. So it's not to the memory of the king alone. We have other reliefs that show the blurring of identities. This is an epigraphic survey drawing of a scene at Medina Habu in the second court, where the bark of Amun, which is shown on the upper register, has the heads of the king. You can see it has a human head in the upper registers, although the inscription says that the god inside is Amun. These barks always have a head that identifies, the head on the bow and stern identifies who's in the boat. So for example, if there's a ram, it's going to be Amun. But here, this is a very clear indication that we have the fusion or the blurring of this identity, where the god Amun is in the bark of King Ramses III. They become unified. We see at the Temple of Seti-I a scene of the king and Amun libated by Horus and Thoth, and the inscription there, the caption is, "Your purification is the purification of Amun-Re, and your purification is the purification of the king." So again, they're fused. They've become one in these rituals. In one scene another scene at Karnak, bark of the king has the cartouches and head of the king, but the voice emanating from the bark, as indicated by the captions and the texts, the voice is of Amun-Re united with eternity. So again, this fusion of the king and Amun. We also have a very interesting notation from the daughter of King Panujam, who ordered the rewrapping of the mummy of Ramses III. This is in Dynasty 21, after the royal tombs were robbed. And the daughter of Panujam III ordered the rewrapping of the mummy of Ramses III, and it was done for, quote, "for her lord, Amun united with eternity, although they know the body is that of Ramses III." And so again, this complete fusion between the god and the king. We see this, for example, at Abu Simbel. Here's another great scene where we have, here's Ramses II with a incense and libation to the bark. And it has falcon heads, which should be Amun-Re, but the inscription says it is Ramses in the domain of Amun. So again, this blurring, complete blurring of the god and the king. Now, more links that help us understand the links between the East and West come from ritual and economic ties between these eastern and western parts of Thebes. Now, rituals, some of these are very East Bank specific. For example, here's a wonderful recreation by Gauvin of the Opet Festival, which was entirely an East Bank phenomenon. It linked the Karnak Temple and the Luxor Temple being shown here. You can see the throngs around the temple during this festival. In others, the king and Amun, or Amun and his entourage, cross the Nile from their home at Karnak or Luxor and visit the West. And so again, linking these parts of the city. In this context, the West Bank is really like an enormous stage set for festival activities. David O'Connor likens the West Bank temples to giant bark shrines for festival processions, because during these festivals, the statue of the god on the boat was carried through all of these temples on the West Bank. One of the easiest festivals to understand how this works is the Festival of the Valley, or the Feast of the Valley, or the Beautiful Feast of the Valley. It has lots of different names. We know of it from textual references in Dynasty 11, so around about 2100 BC. And that text refers to praising Amun and kissing the earth before the Lord of the gods in his summer festival when he crosses over to the valley of Nebhepet-Re. Nebhepet-Re is Mentuhotep. So this is a reference to crossing from the Karnak temple over to the western hills. The Feast of the Valley was held once a year. It was 2 days long. The earliest images we have are from the time of Hatshepsut, and it was celebrated down into the reign of Ptolemy VIII, 117 BC. So we're talking about 2,000 years at least of this festival being celebrated annually at Thebes. And it is only at Thebes, perhaps because the architecture of this city, Thebes, accommodated the festival. Again, it was like an enormous stage set for these festival performances. The basis, of course, is, as we've seen, the West is the land of Hathor and regeneration. Here we have a tomb scene, the mummy propped up in front of the tomb, the wife crying, and then to the left, as we've seen before, the sandy hills of the West with Hathor emerging. So this idea, you go to the West, to the land of regeneration, to create this cycle. In Hatshepsut's time, the statue of Amun went to the West, but it got more complicated. In Dynasty 19, we know that the statues from the East Bank, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the so-called Theban triad, and statues of the living king were part of this big procession. We can trace the route of the festival from texts in temples and in images in these temples. The temples were seen as places, quote, that receive Amun and extol his beauty in the beautiful festival of the valley. And we know these temples were involved because, again, these inscriptions on the architraves and the walls tell us that they were part of these festivals. For example, Amenhotep III's temple has an inscription. It says, its beautiful name, which its majesty has given, is receiving Amun and exalting his beauty. So receiving Amun in the course of the festival. It is a resting place of the Lord of the gods in his festival of the valley, in Amun's procession to the west to visit the gods in the west, is one of these ancient texts. The Ramesseum, the architraves there, say it is a resting place of the Lord of the gods in his beautiful festival of the valley. So we know that this festival, the procession visited this temple as well. So it appears that in the later New Kingdom, the Ramessid period, all the temples in the West were visited by this procession. We have wonderful texts about this, some things talking about, we have graffiti that talk about the watchmen on the West Bank of Thebes who would watch for the procession to leave the Karnak temple and start crossing the river. And they would announce the approach of the flotilla. The main bark is called the Usurhat, this enormous big gold-covered barge that was coming from the east to visit the west. And then people would come out to greet what was called the divine arrival of the boats of the king and the gods. And so in this festival, the boats processed through these structures on the West Bank. So it was like an enormous, noisy parade that would go on once a year. People from the East and the West joined in this procession. And the boats of the king and the gods visited and, as it says in the text, rested in the temples, particularly the temple of the current king and other temples as well. And they were then joined by barks of other deceased kings, which were probably stored in some of the West Bank temples. Amenhotep III has a text. He refers to the Ka of the dead king is revived by Amun's presence. And so again, this idea that in the Feast of the Valley, this procession, the visit, brings the dead spirits alive. On the evening of the first day, the procession went to Darobachri, shown here. Of course, that was particularly sacred to the goddess Hathor, which makes a lot of sense in this context. We have at other scenes, at Medina and Habu, scenes of Amun and the king, meeting Amun united with eternity. Then the first night of the festival, the bark of Amun would actually stay here in the sanctuary at the Darobachri temple, or would spend the night where Amun and Hathor would mythically a sort of symbolic marriage. So it's all about sex in ancient Egypt, basically, rejuvenation, regeneration, and so there was a union of Hathor and Amun that took place in this sanctuary during the Festival of the Valley, Feast of the Valley. And this temple, as a result, became a major pilgrimage site. And when it was being excavated in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the excavators found what was referred to as baskets full of ex-votos, of little wood phalluses and different sorts of fertility figurines, because of this idea of the regeneration of the gods through this nightly visit, the night visit of Amun to Hathor. The king's role in the procession is made clear also by a text of Amenhotep III. He says, "The Lord of the gods at his festival of the valley in Amun's procession to the west to visit the gods in the west, when he, Amun, will reward his majesty with life and dominion." And so again, this was a way of rejuvenating the king. Now, on the second day of the Feast of the Valley, the barks of the dead kings went back to their temples and then went back to Karnak. And you start again next year. Now, the Valley Festival was carried over to the general populace. This was one of the biggest popular festivals in Egypt. And it's a very good illustration of the way that the normal people, the general people, were involved in religious rituals, because also wasn't not only the soul of the ka of the king and the gods that were rejuvenated, but the souls, the cause of all of the people who were buried on the West Bank were also rejuvenated in the Festival of the Valley. We have a text that says, "May you give me a place in the necropolis so that I may see Amun when he visits the temple. May the revered one be refreshed on this day. May what the funerary prayers call for be given to him." So this is one of our best documented opportunities for large-scale community participation in religion. And so here's a scene of the barks, and this is why you see these barks all over the walls of the temples, not only in Luxor, but primarily in Luxor, because these were the conveyances for the gods in the festivals, as not only the Valley Festival, but other festivals. Now this Valley Festival with the public participation sounds like it was a lot of fun. The texts refer to the desire to see the gods in procession. This is from a private tomb. So people desired to see the gods in procession because it helped their dead relatives be revived. So while this parade of these barks, of these boats is going on the West Bank, people are following the procession and making a huge amount of noise. We know there was singing and dancing and drumming. They were encouraged to make a lot of noise because the noise was thought to awaken their dead relatives and bring them forth from their tombs to meet again with their living family members. So it's kind of like Day of the Dead, where you bring forth the spirits of your ancestors. And so there was a lot of eating and drinking, lots of drinking songs, because inebriation was thought to be kind of a liminal state where you could get closer to the gods. So during this time, family members would go to the tombs, they'd spend the night in the tombs and celebrate the memory of their deceased ancestors, which were represented by the reliefs and the statues in those tombs. So there were lots and lots of meals, drinking in honor of Hathor. And in this context, Hathor is actually called the Lady of Drunkenness, which is kind of fun. And one of these texts reads, "For your ka, drink the intoxicating drink. Celebrate a beautiful day. May your heart be refreshed in your tomb." So lots of noise to revive the dead, music, dancing. Another text, "May your voice be true, and may you enter the earth among the august spirits who are with Osiris. May you eat the offerings and participate in the repast like the gods of the netherworld. May you be called into the presence of Osiris, like those who follow Horus are the living ones, unhindered like one of them. May your name endure forever." So part of this festival, also one of the rituals was this, where large floral bouquets were presented to the deceased. And this is a great pun on the part of the Egyptians, because these floral bouquets were called ankh. And ankh is also the name for life. And so they're literally presenting life in the form of these bouquets to the deceased to bring them back to life. Now, the popularity of the Feast of the Valley cannot really be understated. It was so important for the Thebans. So here we have a very aerial view of the approach to the Drabunaga temple, to the Hatshepsut temple, where you remember the barks spent the night for the union of Hathor and Amun. This became a major focus of private tombs, because the procession would go up this causeway that you see. And so from the 11th dynasty, tombs started being built on either side of this causeway in the hills. And then through the rest of Egyptian history, especially in the late period, there are enormous tombs that are built all pointing toward this axis, toward the causeway, because it was thought that the deceased could then eternally participate in the Feast of the Valley every year. Their souls could emerge from their tombs and just look out on these processions as they went up and down the causeway. Well, the ritual connections make it not so surprising, I guess, that we know that the temples were also very strongly linked economically. The temples from the West were sending grain and other sorts of supplies for the rituals to Karnak, and Karnak was sending supplies, grain, oils, incense to the West Bank temple. So again, there's a very strong economic connection between the East and West Bank. So again, this old idea that these are separate entities really is not tenable. These supplies that were being sent were to pay the expenses of the temples for construction and maintenance costs of the temples, for operating costs, for the priests, for offerings. The offerings, the amount of material that's circulating through these temples absolutely boggles the mind. I believe all of these temples had granaries. Some of them are better preserved than others. This is the Ramesseum, the great temple of Ramses II. The temple proper is in the middle left. And then all of the section to the right, you can see those long corridors, those are granaries. That was like the Federal Reserve Bank of Luxor. And this is just one of the temple granaries in the domain of Amun in Thebes. This is where the grain was the major means of exchange and payment in Egypt. This is where it was stored. And so at the Ramesseum, these are called the granary of the divine offerings of the temple of millions of years of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt and house of Amun on the west of Thebes. This is what this was called. And the quantities of material that are coming and going from these places are just mind-boggling. We have at Medina Habu on the south side, this is the calendar that has a list of the festivals, but it is just one of the calendars that also lists what is required for each festival. So this gives us these endless lists of so many measures of grain for this festival, so many loaves of bread, et cetera, for each of these festivals. And this scene at Medina Habu even has a little narration showing priests actually carrying some of these goods. Now, to give you an idea, the Medina Habu calendar daily offering included for one day 2,220 loaves of bread, 30 birds, 144 jars of beer, and 100 bunches of vegetables. That's for one day for one temple. The Ramesseum, the daily grain ration from there was 12,000 sacks, which is about 900,000 liters. So we're talking about absolutely enormous amounts of grain. The offerings required by the daily rituals and festivals then created a Thebes-wide network that tied the temples together, which also underscores how the functions of the East and West were related. So, for example, a calendar from the Karnak from the reign of Ramses IV includes offerings to be transferred to Amun of Karnak from Medina Habu. Calendar at Ramesseum states that the temple was sending grain to Karnak. So again, there's this huge economic network. Well, where is this wealth coming from? We know more about the outgo than the ingo, but we have ledgers. A lot of this wealth was coming from the mines, copper, gold, and silver. We have texts that talked of about 10 mining expeditions jointly sponsored by the Karnak Temple and Medina Habu and the House of Re at Thebes. And so the temples themselves are sponsoring some of these mining expeditions to bring back ore, which of course was another source of wealth. Also, the farms were a huge source of wealth. When I'm talking about the grain, this grain is being grown on farms all through Egypt. These temples in Thebes owned farms throughout Egypt, and a certain amount of that produce was then transferred to Egypt, as I said, like a Federal Reserve Bank, where it was used. This is not only grain, but also flocks and herds. We have many, many censuses of these huge numbers of animals that were being raised on these regional farms and then being brought to Luxor to be used in these temple rituals. So in summary, when looking at Luxor, it's important to remember that really nothing is in isolation. Here we see a scene of Amun with Horemheb. Nothing is purely funerary. Nothing is purely non-funerary. All of the institutions on the West and on the East work together as part of a network of institutions that serve the god Amun and express the divinity of the king. Thank you very much.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.